Arrogance turned to absolute terror the moment Brandon Collins, the town's most feared bully, tried to force an elderly stranger out of his favorite diner booth. He expected a pathetic, cowering victim, but instead he unleashed a storm he couldn't survive. When 3 tactical SUVs screeched into the parking lot and a 4-star general stepped out to salute the man he had just dragged through the mud, the entire town watched in stunned silence as the chief's empire crumbled in seconds. The town of Oak Creek, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place that looked picture-perfect on a postcard, but held dark, suffocating secrets beneath its manicured surface. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, and more importantly, everyone knew their place. At the very top of that unspoken hierarchy was Police Chief Richard Collins. For nearly 2 decades, Chief Collins had run Oak Creek, less like a public servant, and more like a feudal lord. His word was law, his grudges were permanent, and his son, Brandon, was the crown prince who reaped all the benefits of his father's unchecked authority. It was a damp, grey Tuesday afternoon in late October when the fragile peace of Oak Creek was irrevocably shattered. The setting was Maggie's Route 66 diner, a chrome and neon relic that sat on the edge of the county line. The diner was a local institution, famous for its cherry pie, bottomless black coffee, and the weary but warm demeanor of its owner, Margaret Maggie Sullivan. On this particular afternoon, the diner was half full. A few long-haul truckers occupied the counter stools, and a couple of local farmers sat in the corner, discussing the unseasonable frost. But sitting alone in booth 4, the best booth in the house, offering a clear view of both the highway and the front door, was a stranger. His name was Louis Hayes. Louis was a black man in his late 60s, though his posture suggested a man much younger. His hair was cropped close to his scalp, peppered heavily with grey, and his face was etched with the deep, defining lines of a man who had spent a lifetime making hard decisions in harsh climates. He wore a faded, olive-drab field jacket, devoid of any patches or insignia, over a simple black turtleneck. He sat perfectly still, not staring at his phone, not reading a newspaper. He was simply eating his eggs and sipping his coffee, his dark eyes calmly scanning the room with a quiet, observant intensity that most people wouldn't notice, but a trained professional would immediately recognize as situational awareness. Louis had been driving cross-country, taking the back roads, enjoying the silence of retirement. He had stopped in Oak Creek purely by chance, needing a hot meal and a break from the monotonous stretch of the interstate. He didn't know the town's politics. He didn't know the unwritten rules. And he certainly didn't know that Booth 4 was unofficially reserved for the Collins family. The bell above the diner's glass door chimed loudly, cutting through the low hum of the jukebox. In walked Brandon Collins, flanked by his 2 usual sycophants, Trent and Logan. Brandon was 22, built like a linebacker, and wore his arrogance like a heavy cologne. He was dressed in an expensive Letterman jacket from the local university, a university he only attended because his father had made certain donations to the athletic department. Brandon was notorious in Oak Creek. He had a history of DUs that magically disappeared from the records, bar fights where the other guy always ended up in cuffs, and a vicious temper that the townspeople had learned to avoid at all costs. Brandon shook the rain from his hair, laughing loudly at some crude joke Trent had just made. He strutted into the diner, fully expecting the usual treatment, hushed whispers, averted eyes, and Maggie rushing over with a pot of fresh coffee. Maggie tensed behind the counter. She grabbed a rag and wiped down a spotless stretch of formica, her eyes darting nervously toward booth 4. Brandon's laughter died in his throat as his eyes landed on Louis. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heavy boots scuffing against the black and white checkered linoleum. His jaw tightened. He looked at Trent, then at Logan, and a cruel, predatory smirk slowly spread across his face. "Maggie," Brandon called out, his voice booming over the soft country music playing from the jukebox. "Why is there a stray sitting in my booth?" The diner went dead silent. The farmers stopped talking. The truckers put down their forks. The tension in the room spiked instantly, thick and suffocating. Maggie swallowed hard, stepping out from behind the counter. "Brandon, please. There are plenty of other booths open. He's just passing through. Let him finish his meal." Brandon ignored her. He didn't break eye contact with Lewis, who had not even flinched at the loud insult. Lewis continued to slowly cut his toast, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "I don't think you heard me, Maggie," Brandon said, taking a slow, heavy step toward booth 4. "I said, there's a stray in my booth, and you know I don't like eating where vagrants have been resting their dirty boots." Louis paused. He placed his knife and fork down on the porcelain plate. The clinking sound was soft, but in the dead silence of the diner, it echoed like a gunshot. Lewis picked up his coffee mug, took a slow sip, and set it down. He didn't look at Brandon. He just stared out the rain-streaked window. "Hey!" Brandon barked, closing the distance until he was towering over the table. "Old man, are you deaf? I'm talking to you." Louis slowly turned his head. His expression was completely blank. There was no fear in his eyes. There was no anger. It was a look of cold, calculating assessment. He looked at Brandon the way a scientist might look at a mildly annoying insect. "I'm eating," Louis said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and commanded an immediate, undeniable authority. It wasn't loud, but it resonated in the chest of everyone listening. "There are 6 empty tables. Pick one, son." Trent and Logan gasped quietly. No one in Oak Creek ever spoke to Brandon Collins like that. Not ever. Brandon's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. The veins in his thick neck bulged. He wasn't used to defiance, let alone from an outsider, and certainly not in front of his friends and the townspeople he terrorized. The smirk vanished, replaced by a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "Son," Brandon hissed, leaning over the table, pressing his large hands flat onto the formica. "Do you have any idea who the hell you're talking to? My father is Chief Richard Collins. This town belongs to us. This diner belongs to us. And this booth is mine. So you have exactly 3 seconds to get your old, pathetic self out of that seat before I throw you through that front window." Lewis didn't blink. He didn't shift his weight. He looked at Brandon's hands, then up to his furious eyes. 1, Brandon counted. Maggie rushed forward, her hands shaking. "Brandon, stop! I'll comp your meal. Just leave him alone, please, he doesn't know." 2, Brandon sneered, ignoring the desperate diner owner. Louis sighed softly. It wasn't a sigh of fear. It was a sigh of profound exhaustion. It was the sigh of a man who had spent a lifetime watching boys try to act like men and knowing exactly how it was going to end. 3. Brandon didn't wait for Lewis to move. Driven by bruised ego and blind entitlement, he reached across the table and swiped his massive arm, knocking Lewis's plate, coffee mug, and silverware onto the floor. The ceramic shattered with a violent crash. Hot black coffee splashed across the legs of Lewis's faded olive trousers. Maggie screamed. The truckers flinched, but out of fear of the chief's retaliation, they kept their heads down, their knuckles white as they gripped the counter. Louis looked down at the shattered mess on the floor. He looked at the coffee staining his trousers. Then, very slowly, he stood up. Despite his age, Louis was 6 feet 2 inches tall, and when he stood straight, he cast a formidable shadow. He didn't puff out his chest, he didn't raise his fists, but the sheer, immovable presence he exuded caused Brandon to instinctively take a half step back. For a fraction of a second, A flicker of uncertainty crossed the young bully's face. But Brandon couldn't back down. Not in front of Trent and Logan. Not in front of the town. "You think you're tough, old man," Brandon spat, recovering his false bravado. "You think because you stand up, I won't put you right back down?" Lewis looked Brandon dead in the eyes. "You have made a severe miscalculation, young man. I strongly suggest you pay for the dishes you broke, apologize to the lady, and walk away." The sheer calmness of Lewis's delivery infuriated Brandon more than a punch would have. It was dismissive. It was pitying. With a primal grunt, Brandon lunged forward. He grabbed the lapels of Lewis's faded field jacket with both of his meaty hands. Now, to the casual observer, what happened next looked like a strong, aggressive young man overpowering a frail, elderly victim. But to a trained eye, a completely different narrative was unfolding. As Brandon grabbed him, Louis shifted his center of gravity. His hands instinctively twitched, his fingers curving, a deeply ingrained muscle memory preparing to strike a devastating blow to Brandon's throat or break his wrists. But Louis stopped himself. In a fraction of a millisecond, Louis made a tactical decision. He could cripple this boy right here in the diner. He had the training, the speed, and the legal justification of self-defense. But he also saw the terrified faces of the patrons. He saw Maggie weeping in the corner. He realized that if he dismantled the police chief's son, the corrupt local police force would descend on this diner, likely destroying Maggie's livelihood and terrorizing these innocent bystanders. Lewis decided to absorb the indignity. He decided to let the boy hang himself with his own rope. So, Lewis went slack. He offered zero resistance. Brandon, fueled by adrenaline and entirely unaware of how close he had just come to having his arm snapped in 3 places, yanked Lewis forward. "Get the hell out of my diner!" Brandon roared, laughing a manic, unhinged laugh as he dragged the older man out of the booth. "Brandon, please," Maggie sobbed, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." "I am the police, Maggie," Brandon shouted back, jerking Lewis hard toward the door. Trent and Logan were laughing now, too, cheering their friend on like they were at a frat party. Louis allowed himself to be pulled. His boots dragged across the checkered floor, squeaking against the linoleum. He kept his hands at his sides, his face an impenetrable mask of stone. He was assessing the environment, noting the security camera in the corner, noting the exits, entirely detached from the physical humiliation being inflicted upon him. Brandon shoved the glass door open with his shoulder, dragging Lewis out into the cold, drizzling rain. The gravel parking lot was slick and muddy. "Look at this!" Brandon yelled to the empty parking lot, spinning Lewis around. "Look at the tough guy now!" With a violent shove, Brandon pushed Lewis backward. Lewis controlled his fall flawlessly, rolling his shoulder to absorb the impact as he hit the wet gravel, ending up on one knee in a muddy puddle. Brandon stood over him, chest heaving, a triumphant, sadistic grin plastered across his face. Trent and Logan jogged out of the diner, hooting and high-fiving Brandon. Inside, the patrons watched through the large, neon-lit windows, their faces pale with guilt and horror. "You see that, old man?" Brandon taunted, kicking a spray of wet gravel into Lewis's face. "That's what happens when you don't know your place. Next time you come through Oak Creek, you keep your head down, and you keep driving." Lewis didn't wipe the gravel from his cheek. He didn't rise. He remained on one knee in the rain, looking up at Brandon. "Are you finished?" Louis asked. His voice was just as calm, just as steady as it had been inside. The cold rain dripped from his short grey hair, washing the dirt down his jawline. Brandon's grin faltered. The lack of fear, the lack of begging. It was unsettling him. "I'll be finished when I say I'm finished," he growled, raising his boot, preparing to kick the kneeling man in the ribs. But the kick never came, because before Brandon could shift his weight, The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was a deep, rhythmic, guttural rumble that seemed to shake the rain right out of the air. It sounded like a freight train was coming down the county highway, but there were no tracks for miles. Brandon lowered his foot, frowning as he looked toward the road. Trent and Logan stopped laughing. Inside the diner, the patrons pressed their faces against the glass. Through the grey mist and the pouring rain, headlights pierced the gloom. Not just two. Dozens. They came over the crest of the hill in a perfectly spaced, tactical formation. First came two heavy-duty police interceptors, but they weren't the standard Oak Creek cruisers. These were state police, their red and blue lights flashing silently, piercing the dreary afternoon. Immediately behind the state troopers came the true source of the earth-shaking rumble, a fleet of 6 matte black, heavily armored Chevrolet Suburbans. They had no civilian license plates, only stark white U.S. government stenciling on the bumpers. The vehicles were massive, intimidating, and moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision. Trailing the Suburbans were 2 olive-drab military transport trucks, the kind used for rapid deployment, their massive tires churning up the asphalt as they flanked the rear. The entire convoy didn't just pass by the diner, it aggressively swerved into the parking lot. Brandon froze, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. The smug arrogance melted off his face, replaced by a profound, primal confusion. He stepped away from Louis, instinctively retreating toward his friends. The state police cruisers blocked the exits to the highway, completely locking down the diner. The 6 black Suburbans fanned out in a semicircle, perfectly boxing in Brandon, Trent, Logan, and the kneeling Louis. The engines idled with a menacing purr. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hitting the metal roofs of the armored vehicles. "What is this?" Trent stammered, backing up against the brick wall of the diner. Brandon puffed out his chest, trying to salvage his bravado. It's probably a motorcade. Federal task force or something. My dad mentioned they were doing maneuvers upstate. They probably need directions or want to use the diner." Brandon wiped the rain from his eyes and took a step forward, straightening his expensive jacket, preparing to introduce himself as the chief's son. He expected deference. He expected to be treated as a fellow member of the authority class. The doors of the Suburbans opened simultaneously. The coordination was flawless. Out stepped over a dozen men and women in full tactical military dress. They weren't holding umbrellas. They ignored the rain entirely. They were broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and moved with a terrifyingly quiet efficiency. They didn't draw weapons, but their hands rested casually near their sidearms as they established a secure perimeter around the parking lot. Then the rear door of the lead Suburban, the heaviest and most armored of the fleet, swung open. A man stepped out. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with sharp, hawk-like features and silver hair neatly parted. He wore the impeccable, pristine dress uniform of the United States Army. The dark green fabric stood out starkly against the grey day. But it wasn't the uniform that made Brandon's breath catch in his throat. It was the shoulders. Gleaming proudly on the epaulets of the man's uniform were 4 silver stars. General Thomas Harrington, commander of the United States Armed Forces Strategic Command. A man whose name was whispered with reverence in the halls of the Pentagon. A man who had commanded theaters of war and directed global operations. The general did not look at the diner. He did not look at the rain. And he certainly did not look at Brandon Collins, who was currently standing with his mouth hanging open like a dying fish. General Harrington's eyes were locked entirely on the older black man kneeling in the mud. Brandon, completely misreading the situation through the lens of his own immense ego, thought the general was looking at the vagrant with disgust. Brandon took a step forward, raising his hand, trying to sound authoritative. "General, sir!" Brandon shouted over the rain. "I'm Brandon Collins, son of the police chief. Sorry about the mess here. I was just clearing this vagrant off the property so you and your men can use the facilities." General Harrington didn't even acknowledge Brandon's existence. He didn't turn his head. He didn't blink. He walked right past the 22-year-old bully as if Brandon were nothing more than a puddle of dirty water on the asphalt. The silence in the parking lot was absolute, save for the patter of the rain. Inside the diner, Maggie and the patrons held their breath, their minds unable to process what they were witnessing. General Harrington stopped exactly 3 feet away from Lewis. The general stood perfectly rigid. He snapped his boots together, the sound echoing sharply against the armored vehicles. He straightened his spine, squared his shoulders, and slowly, deliberately, raised his right hand to the brim of his cap in a razor-sharp, flawless military salute. He held it there. "Colonel Hayes, sir." General Harrington's voice rang out, clear and powerful, carrying immense respect. "It is an honor to finally find you, sir. The Joint Chiefs have been looking all over the eastern seaboard for you." Brandon's blood ran colder than the Pennsylvania rain. His eyes darted from the 4-star general, saluting, down to the man he had just dragged through the mud. Louis Hayes, the quiet, elderly black man in the faded jacket, the man Brandon had just called a vagrant, the man he had shoved into the gravel, did not immediately stand. Louis slowly reached up and wiped the wet gravel from his cheek. He looked at the mud on his hands. Then he looked up at the 4-star general. Louis sighed, a sound of profound, world-weary annoyance. "Thomas," Louis said quietly from the mud, "I told the Pentagon I was retired, and I specifically requested no parades." General Harrington maintained his salute, a slight, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. "With respect, Colonel, when the President of the United States asks for your specific counsel on a matter of national security, your retirement is considered temporarily suspended. Let me help you up, sir." "I can stand on my own, Thomas," Louis replied firmly, and with a fluid grace that completely belied his age, Louis Hayes rose from the mud. He didn't dust off his knees. He didn't check his clothes. He stood to his full 6'2" height, looked General Harrington in the eye, and sharply returned the salute. Only then did the general drop his hand. Brandon Collins felt his knees go weak. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing terror. He backed up, bumping into Trent, who was visibly shaking. Louis finally turned his gaze away from the general and looked at Brandon. The look in Louis's eyes hadn't changed. It was the same cold, calculating assessment he had given the boy inside the diner. But now, backed by the full might of the United States military, that look carried the weight of an oncoming execution. "General," Louis said softly, never taking his eyes off Brandon. "Yes, Colonel?" Harrington replied, turning his steely gaze toward the pale, trembling 22-year-old. "This young man here," Louis said, pointing a single mud-stained finger at Brandon, "was just explaining to me how this town belongs to him and his father. I believe he mentioned he is the police." General Harrington's eyes narrowed. He looked at Brandon, taking in the expensive jacket, the trembling hands, the utter cowardice radiating off him. The general's lip curled in absolute disgust. "Is that so, Colonel?" Harrington asked softly. "Indeed," Louis replied, stepping forward, closing the distance between himself and Brandon. "He also owes the lady inside for a broken plate and a spilled coffee." Brandon opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to scream, to run, but no sound came out. The Crown Prince of Oak Creek had just realized, with devastating clarity, that his father's badge couldn't protect him from the wrath of the gods he had just foolishly awakened. The wail of a police siren pierced the heavy, rain-soaked air, echoing off the rolling Pennsylvania hills. Down the two-lane highway, a heavily modified Ford Explorer police cruiser roared toward Maggie's diner, its light bar flashing blinding red and blue through the grey afternoon mist. The vehicle didn't just pull into the parking lot, it skidded aggressively onto the gravel, coming to a halt just inches from the bumper of one of the military Suburbans. The driver's side door kicked open, and out stepped Chief Richard Collins. Richard Collins was a man who wore his authority like a loaded weapon. He was built like a brick wall, his uniform tailored tightly to emphasize a barrel chest that had, over the years, begun to surrender to a heavy gut. His face was ruddy, his jaw thick, and his eyes carried the perpetual suspicious squint of a man used to finding reasons to punish people. He rested his hand heavily on the butt of his Glock 22 as he surveyed the scene. Maggie had made the call when Brandon first started dragging Lewis. She had hoped the chief would intervene to stop his son, or at least minimize the damage. But as Chief Collins took in the sight of the armored federal vehicles, the state police cruisers, and the heavily armed tactical operators standing in the rain, his initial confusion quickly morphed into deep, defensive anger. "Brandon!" Chief Collins barked, his voice cutting through the steady patter of the rain. "Get over here!" Brandon, who had been frozen in terror, practically scrambled toward his father, almost tripping over his own expensive boots. He hid behind the chief's massive shoulder, shivering, his previous bravado completely evaporated. "Dad," Brandon whimpered, his voice cracking. "Dad, I didn't know." Chief Collins shoved his son behind him and marched forward, his boots crunching loudly on the wet gravel. He completely ignored the four-star general standing in the center of the lot. Instead, his eyes locked onto Lewis, who was standing quietly, mud staining his trousers and field jacket. In the chief's mind, this was still his town, his jurisdiction, and his rules. "I don't know what kind of federal circus this is," Chief Collins sneered, coming to a halt a few feet away from the military detail. He puffed out his chest, looking directly at General Harrington. "But I am the chief of police in Oak Creek, and nobody runs an operation in my county without my explicit authorization. Now, I suggest you load up your boys and move along. I have a vagrant to arrest for assaulting my son." The silence that followed was absolute. None of the tactical operators moved. They didn't even shift their weight. They simply stared at Chief Collins from behind the rain-streaked visors of their helmets, their faces completely unreadable. General Harrington, who had spent his career negotiating with foreign dictators and managing global crises, looked at the small-town police chief with an expression of profound, clinical disbelief. Lewis Hayes, however, simply sighed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean, neatly folded white handkerchief, and began to wipe the mud from his hands. "Assaulting your son?" General Harrington repeated, his voice dangerously low, carrying the smooth, deadly calm of a predator about to strike. "You heard me," Collins snapped, taking a step closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate the older military man. "This stray comes into my town, causes a disturbance in Maggie's diner, and lays hands on my boy. That's aggravated assault. He's going to a holding cell, and you federal boys can go play G.I. Joe somewhere else." General Harrington slowly turned his head to look at Lewis. "Colonel Hayes, did you assault this man's son?" Louis folded his handkerchief and placed it back into his pocket. He looked at Chief Collins, then at Brandon, cowering behind him. "Thomas," Lewis said quietly, "if I had wanted to assault that boy, he would currently be breathing through a plastic tube in an intensive care unit. I simply allowed him to drag me outside. It seemed the most efficient way to de-escalate the situation and protect the civilians in the diner from his temper tantrum." Chief Collins's face turned a violent shade of purple. "You lying piece of—" Collins lunged forward, his hand unlatching the retention strap on his holster. He didn't make it a single step. In a blur of motion so fast it defied human comprehension, two of the tactical operators stepped between the chief and the colonel. The metallic clack-clack of assault rifles chambering rounds echoed like thunderclaps across the parking lot. 4 red laser dots instantly materialized on the center of Chief Collins's chest. Collins froze, his hand hovering over his sidearm, the color draining entirely from his face. "Chief Collins," General Harrington said, his voice now echoing with the full, terrifying authority of the United States Armed Forces. "You are currently reaching for a weapon in the presence of the Commander of Strategic Command and a highly decorated former commander of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. I highly advise you to remove your hand from your hip, or my operators will drop you where you stand." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Delta Force. Inside the diner, the truckers, several of whom were veterans, gasped aloud. Chief Collins slowly, very slowly, raised his hands, stepping back. His arrogance was suddenly replaced by a cold, dawning horror. "You don't know who this man is, do you, Chief?" General Harrington asked, gesturing to Louis. "Let me educate you. Colonel Lewis Hayes is a 2-time recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross. He holds 3 Silver Stars. He led the extraction team in Mogadishu during Operation Gothic Serpent. He has spent 35 years executing missions in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the globe, so that men like you can sleep safely in your beds and pretend you have power." Harrington stepped closer to Collins, his eyes boring into the corrupt cop. "Colonel Hayes has killed men who run entire cartels. He has dismantled terrorist cells with nothing but a combat knife and an encrypted radio. And you think your spoiled, pathetic son dragged him out of that diner because he overpowered him?" The general let out a short, humorless laugh. "Your son is breathing right now strictly because Colonel Hayes is a man of extraordinary discipline and mercy. A mercy, I assure you, that I do not share." Brandon began to sob quietly behind his father. The reality of how close he had come to a violent end was finally crashing down on him. But the nightmare for the Collins family was only just beginning. Chief Collins tried to salvage whatever scraps of dignity he had left. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and forced a shaky glare at the general. "Fine," Collins spat, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound tough. "You feds want to protect your own? Take him. Get him out of my town. But don't ever let me catch him driving through Oak Creek again." Louis, who had been quietly watching the exchange, finally stepped forward. The tactical operators parted seamlessly to let him through. He walked right up to Chief Collins, standing toe-to-toe with the corrupt officer. Despite the mud on his clothes, Louis radiated an aura of absolute dominance. "You misunderstand the situation, Mr. Collins," Louis said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying with devastating clarity. "I am not the one leaving this town. You are." Collins frowned, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "What the hell are you talking about?" "General," Louis said, not looking away from the chief. "I noticed 2 Pennsylvania State Police cruisers escorting your motorcade. Was that purely for traffic control, or did Agent Miller finally get the green light?" General Harrington smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a shark tasting blood in the water. "Agent Miller has been waiting very patiently for a federal perimeter to secure this town, Colonel. Your incident here provided the perfect tactical opportunity. Before Chief Collins could process what that meant, the doors of the 2 state police interceptors swung open. 4 state troopers stepped out, followed by a tall, sharp-suited man holding a thick manila folder. This was Special Agent David Miller of the State Bureau of Investigation. Agent Miller walked briskly across the wet gravel, ignoring the rain soaking his expensive suit. He didn't look at the military operators. His eyes were locked entirely on Chief Richard Collins. "Richard Collins," Agent Miller announced, his voice ringing out over the parking lot. "You are hereby relieved of your duties as Chief of Police for Oak Creek." Collins took a step back, genuine fear finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "Miller? What is this? You can't do this. I have the mayor in my pocket. I have the judges—" "Not anymore, Richard," Miller interrupted sharply. "As of 0600 hours this morning, a federal grand jury unsealed a 42-page indictment against you. We have you on wiretap. We have the offshore accounts. We have the extortion records from local businesses, the tampered evidence in your son's DUI cases, and the racketeering charges spanning a decade." Agent Miller gestured to the diner. "We even have testimony from Margaret Sullivan regarding the weekly protection money you've been forcing her to pay just to keep her doors open." Inside the diner, Maggie covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't crying out of fear anymore. She was crying out of sheer, overwhelming relief. The nightmare that had held her town hostage for 20 years was finally ending. "You have no jurisdiction here without a local warrant," Collins yelled, completely losing his composure, reaching frantically for his radio. "I'm calling my deputies. Every officer in Oak Creek is coming down here." "I highly doubt that, Chief," Agent Miller said calmly. "Because right now, FBI field teams are simultaneously raiding your precinct and your home. Half your deputies are already in handcuffs. The rest are cooperating for reduced sentences." Collins stood completely paralyzed. His empire, built on fear and intimidation, was dissolving into dust right in front of his eyes. "Arrest him," Miller ordered the state troopers. As the troopers moved in, Brandon panicked. The 22-year-old bully, realizing his shield was gone and he was about to face the consequences of a lifetime of cruelty, made the worst decision of his life. He shoved his father forward into the troopers and bolted toward the woods behind the diner. "Run, Brandon!" Trent and Logan yelled, before immediately dropping to their knees and putting their hands behind their heads, terrified of the Delta operators. Brandon sprinted across the wet gravel, his heavy boots slipping in the mud. He didn't even make it 10 yards. One of the military operators simply stepped into his path, hooked his foot behind Brandon's ankle, and delivered a precise, open-handed strike to the young man's chest. Brandon hit the ground with a sickening thud, all the breath knocked out of his lungs. Before he could even gasp for air, the operator had him flipped onto his stomach, a heavy combat boot resting firmly between his shoulder blades, his arms pinned painfully behind his back. "Suspect secured," the operator stated flatly, tossing a pair of heavy-duty zip ties to a joggling state trooper. Back at the cruisers, Chief Collins was forcefully slammed against the hood of his own vehicle. He screamed and cursed as the troopers stripped him of his badge, his weapon, and his dignity. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed like a final judge's gavel across the parking lot. Lewis Hayes watched the entire scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. He turned to General Harrington. "A bit theatrical, Thomas," Lewis noted dryly, "but effective. We do what we must for national security, Colonel," Harrington replied smoothly. "And frankly, taking out the local trash was a pleasant bonus. Now, sir, we have a secure jet waiting at Andrews Air Force Base. The President's briefing is at 1800 hours. Will you come with us?" Louis looked at the armored Suburbans, then back at the diner. He saw Maggie standing in the doorway, her hands clasped together, looking at him with profound awe and gratitude. "Give me 5 minutes, Thomas," Louis said. "I believe I still owe a lady for a broken plate." Louis walked slowly back toward the diner. The crowd of patrons parted for him, like the Red Sea. He approached Maggie, pulling a leather wallet from his interior jacket pocket. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and laid it gently on the counter. "For the dishes, ma'am," Louis said softly. "And the coffee. It was excellent, by the way." Maggie shook her head, tears spilling over her cheeks. "No, sir. Please. Your money is no good here. Not today. Not ever. Thank you. Thank you for what you just did." Louis offered her a small, gentle smile, the first one he had shown all day. "I didn't do anything, Maggie. The trash just finally took itself out." He turned and walked back out into the rain, leaving the citizens of Oak Creek to watch as the quiet man they had dismissed as a vagrant climbed into the back of a heavily armored federal convoy, leaving behind a town forever changed. The heavy steel door of the armored Suburban slammed shut, sealing Louis Hayes inside a soundproof, climate-controlled bubble that smelled faintly of gun oil and premium leather. Outside the tinted ballistic glass, the shocked citizens of Oak Creek and the handcuffed remnants of the corrupt local police department faded into the rainy background. As the convoy accelerated seamlessly onto the highway, shedding its state police escort to merge into high-speed federal traffic lanes, General Harrington pressed a button on the center console. The privacy partition separating them from the driver slid up, and the soft, ambient lighting shifted to a sterile, tactical blue. "I apologize for interrupting your drive, Colonel," Harrington said, opening a biometric lockbox bolted to the floorboards. "I know you were enjoying the scenic route to nowhere in particular." "I was eating a surprisingly good plate of eggs, Thomas," Louis replied, leaning back into the leather seat. He didn't look angry, just focused. The weary, elderly man from the diner had completely vanished, replaced by the apex predator the military had spent millions of dollars training. "You didn't mobilize a Delta element and coordinate a state-level FBI raid just to give me a ride. What's the situation?" Harrington pulled a thick, red-bordered, classified folder from the lockbox and handed it across the cabin. 48 hours ago, Harrington began, his tone dropping into the grim cadence of a wartime briefing. A highly sensitive CIA extraction went sideways in the Chechen borderlands. Our operative was moving a defecting Russian bioweapons engineer to a safe house in Tbilisi. They were ambushed. The engineer was killed in the crossfire. Louis opened the file. The top page featured a high-resolution satellite photograph of a smoking convoy in a snow-covered mountain pass. "And the operative? Captured alive," Harrington said grimly. "Taken by an off-the-books mercenary unit, operating under the radar of the Kremlin. They're holding him in a fortified, decommissioned Soviet radar station. We have satellite overwatch, but the location is buried deep inside hostile airspace. We can't use drones without triggering an international incident, and a conventional strike force would be seen 100 miles away." Louis flipped to the next page, revealing a photograph of a bruised, bloodied man staring defiantly into a camera held by his captors. Louis's stoic expression hardened. His knuckles went white against the edges of the folder. The captive was Samuel Bennett. Samuel had been one of Louis's most promising recruits, a farm boy from Ohio with a mind like a supercomputer and the nerves of a bomb disposal expert. Louis had personally molded him, taught him how to survive the darkest interrogations, and treated him like the son he never had. "They sent a proof-of-life video directly to Langley this morning," Harrington continued softly, watching Louis's reaction. "They don't want money, Louis. They want to trade him for 3 high-value prisoners currently sitting in Guantanamo. The president is refusing to negotiate with terrorists, but he also refuses to leave Bennett to be tortured and executed on the dark web." "Who is the commander of the mercenary unit?" Louis asked, his voice lethally calm. Harrington slid a single photograph across the table. It was a grainy surveillance shot of a tall, scarred man smoking a cigar. "Grigory Volkov. The same Grigory Volkov you threw out of a 3rd-story window in Beirut in 1998. Louis stared at the photograph. The ghosts of his past were violently crashing into his present. Volkov was a sadist, a man who held grudges for decades. If Volkov knew who Samuel Bennett was, and who had trained him, Samuel's suffering would be unimaginable. "The Joint Chiefs gave the President 3 options," Harrington said. "All of them carry a 60% casualty rate for the rescue team, and a 90% probability that Bennett is executed the moment we breach the perimeter." "And the 4th option?" Louis asked, closing the folder. "The President asked what Colonel Lewis Hayes would do," Harrington replied. "We have a C-17 Globemaster idling on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base. It is loaded with specialized halo gear, an experimental stealth glider, and a hand-picked 4-man team from your old unit. They refused to board unless you were leading the briefing. We need your operational mind, Lewis. You know Volkov's defensive tactics better than anyone alive. You know how he fortifies a perimeter. We need you to draw the map." Lewis looked out the window. The rain had stopped, giving way to a bruised purple twilight. He thought of the young bully in Oak Creek, a boy who thought power was a badge and a loud voice. Then he thought of Samuel Bennett, a man who understood that true power was sacrifice. "Tell the pilot at Andrews to start his pre-flight," Lewis said, unbuttoning his soiled field jacket. "And get me a secure line to Langley. I need Volkov's thermal blueprints from the last 10 years, and I need them 5 minutes ago." General Harrington smiled, a genuine look of relief washing over his weathered face. "Welcome back, Colonel." While Louis prepared to orchestrate a shadow war halfway across the globe, the town of Oak Creek was experiencing its own massive upheaval. The diner had become ground zero for the federal operation. Dozens of FBI agents flooded the town, seizing filing cabinets from the police precinct, auditing the town hall, and interviewing terrified deputies who were desperate to cut deals. The local news stations had caught wind of the raid, and by nightfall, news helicopters were circling Oak Creek. The story was sensational. A deeply entrenched, corrupt police chief and his tyrannical son taken down in a sweeping federal sting, all sparked by an altercation with a mysterious stranger at a roadside diner. Maggie Sullivan found herself the center of attention. When reporters shoved microphones in her face, asking about the man who had brought down the Collins empire, Maggie only smiled warmly. "He wasn't a vagrant," Maggie said, looking directly into the camera lenses. "He was a gentleman, and he was exactly what this town needed." 6 months later, the biting chill of October had long surrendered to the bright, hopeful warmth of a Pennsylvania spring. Oak Creek looked the same on the surface. The rolling green hills, the quiet streets, the vintage storefronts, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The suffocating cloud of fear that had hung over the town for 2 decades had finally evaporated. In a federal courthouse 200 miles away, Judge Harrison Caldwell had delivered the final, crushing blows to the Collins family. Chief Richard Collins was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for racketeering, extortion, and severe civil rights violations. His son, Brandon Collins, having had all of his previously buried DUIs and assault charges unsealed and piled onto the federal indictments, was handed a harsh 8-year sentence. When the verdict was read, Brandon wept, looking around the courtroom for a father who could no longer protect him, and a town that no longer feared him. Back in Oak Creek, Maggie's Route 66 diner was thriving. Without the burden of Chief Collins's weekly protection fees, Maggie had finally been able to afford the renovations she had dreamed of. The faded neon sign out front was fully repaired, glowing a vibrant cherry red. The cracked linoleum had been replaced, and the jukebox was loaded with new records. It was a busy Tuesday afternoon. The diner was packed with locals, laughing freely, chatting without glancing nervously over their shoulders. At exactly 1:15 p.m., the brass bell above the glass door chimed loudly. The usual diner chatter continued, but Maggie, who was pouring coffee at the counter, glanced up. She froze, the coffee pot hovering in midair. Standing in the doorway was Lewis Hayes. He looked different. The faded, mud-stained field jacket was gone, replaced by a sharply tailored, charcoal-grey suit that spoke of quiet wealth and deep respect. His posture was still impeccably straight, his eyes still sharp and observant, but the heavy, world-weary exhaustion seemed to have lifted from his shoulders. The diner slowly grew quiet as a few of the regulars recognized the man from the news reports, the mysterious colonel who had broken the town's curse. Louis offered a polite, subtle nod to the room, then locked eyes with Maggie. He smiled. "I hope I'm not interrupting the lunch rush," Louis said, his deep voice carrying warmly across the room. Maggie quickly set the coffee pot down, wiped her hands on her apron, and practically ran around the counter. She didn't offer to shake his hand. She threw her arms around the tall man, hugging him tightly. "You are always welcome here, sir," Maggie said, her voice thick with emotion as she pulled back. "Always." "Louis, please, just Louis," he replied gently. "Well, Louis," Maggie beamed, gesturing toward the back of the diner. "Your booth is waiting." Louis walked toward booth 4. It was spotless, and unlike before, there was no invisible aura of dread surrounding it. It was just a booth with the best view of the highway. He slid into the comfortable red vinyl seat, looking out the sparkling clean window. Before Maggie could even ask, a fresh cup of black coffee and a large slice of cherry pie were placed on the table. But it wasn't Maggie who set them down. It was a young man in a crisp, immaculately clean Oak Creek police uniform. He had a gold star pinned to his chest. This was Sheriff Thomas Dalton, an honest, reform-minded officer the state had brought in to clean up the precinct. Sheriff Dalton stood at attention, removed his campaign hat, and held it respectfully against his chest. "Colonel Hayes," Sheriff Dalton said, his tone filled with genuine reverence. "I'm Thomas Dalton. I took over the department after the restructuring." Louis looked at the young officer, assessing him in the span of a single heartbeat. He saw clean fingernails, steady eyes, and a posture built on duty, not ego. Louis nodded in approval. "It's a tough job cleaning up someone else's mess, Sheriff," Louis said. "But the town looks like it's breathing again." "You're doing good work," Dalton flushed with pride. "Thank you, sir. I just wanted to say. The coffee and pie are on the department today. And if you ever need anything while you're in Oak Creek, you have my personal cell number." Sheriff Dalton placed a neat business card on the table, nodded respectfully, and stepped away to let the man eat in peace. Louis looked at the business card, then out the window at the quiet, sunlit parking lot where, just 6 months prior, he had knelt in the mud. He took a sip of the hot black coffee. It tasted like victory. He had just returned from a covert black site base in Poland. Samuel Bennett had been successfully extracted. Grigory Volkov's mercenary unit was entirely dismantled, reduced to ash and classified footnotes. Louis had done his job, protected his country, and saved his friend. Now, his retirement was officially, permanently reinstated. No more motorcades, no more generals, just the open road, the quiet hum of an engine, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be. Louis picked up his fork, cut a piece of the warm cherry pie, and watched the cars roll down the highway, finally at peace. The story of Louis Hayes and the arrogant police chief's son is a powerful reminder that true strength doesn't need to shout, and real power doesn't demand to be feared. The bullies of the world rely on intimidation, unaware that the quietest people in the room often carry the most profound resilience and dangerous capabilities. Brandon Collins mistook patience for weakness, and paid the ultimate price, losing his empire to the very man he tried to humiliate. It shows us that justice, though sometimes delayed, always arrives with an undeniable force when the wicked push too far. If this story of ultimate justice and hidden heroism gave you chills, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a perfect karma story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible, real-life tales of respect, revenge, and redemption. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in the diner? See you in the next video.